In this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about block diagrams. So as I've mentioned previously, we've seen block diagrams, we've been using them, but we're going to come back now and sort of define things a little bit more explicitly. So here I have just a really simple system. We have some input R of S, some output C of S, and some transfer function G of S. And so again, we've not defined this explicitly before, but the arrows here, the R of S and the C of S, are signals. So we would have, for instance, an input signal or an output signal. So for block diagrams, our arrows are representing signals, whereas our blocks are representing our system. And so the main reason we want to be explicit about this is, of course, we're going to see it's a little bit different when we are dealing with our signal flow graphs later on. Okay, so another couple items that we have seen before, but we weren't necessarily explicit about, are our summing junctions and our pickoff points. So let's start by looking at our summing junction. And so our summing junction, of course, as we've seen, we can have multiple signals coming into one point being either added or subtracted. So for instance, let's say we have some input R1 of S and some other input R2 of S, just coming from somewhere else in our system, or some various inputs, maybe they're not coming from our system. And then we have some signal coming out, and so we can say this is C of S. So now remember, we have to specify whether signals are being added or subtracted at our summing junction. So we can either have our signs outside, or sometimes you'll see them put inside the summing junction itself. So if this signal R1 is being added and this signal R2 is being subtracted, we would see signs like this around our summing junction. So this would indicate that we have CS is equal to R1 of S minus R2 of S in this case. Okay, so one other item which we have, again, we've probably seen it, but we've not mentioned it explicitly, is something called a pickoff point. And so maybe we have some signal R of S. And maybe this R of S needs to go as an input to more than one place. So what we'll do is we can take a line and draw it off of this, and we can have R of S at more than one place. And so sometimes we'll put a little dot there to indicate we're breaking off and it connects, sometimes we won't. Just kind of depends on the context. I think usually in the textbook it leaves that off. So we can pick that off and we can take this to another place as well. Ideally, we can do that as many times as we want. Of course, practically, we're going to have some limitations as we're loading down the input, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But for the most part, we're going to stick to just idealities in this course. So the next thing that we want to talk about is how do we sort of move blocks around these configurations. So we'll come back in the next video and we'll look at how do we move blocks around a summing junction and how do we move blocks around a pickoff point. And the reason that's going to be useful is if we want to be combining blocks, sometimes we have to be able to move them to the other side of a summing junction and or a pickoff point.